April 13th, 1989. The Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles was packed wall to wall, and the air inside had that electric, expectant hum that only happens when black music's biggest names are all sitting in the same room. The Soul Train Music Awards were supposed to be a celebration, a night where the culture honored its own. Whitney Houston was sitting near the front, her hair done, her dress perfect, that famous smile already half formed on her face. She'd been nominated again. She'd already won before. By every measure that mattered in the industry, she was untouchable. The biggest selling female vocalist on the planet, a voice that had redefined what pop music could sound like. Then they called her name, and instead of applause, a wave of boos rolled through the auditorium. Not scattered, not faint. Loud enough that everyone in the room heard it. Loud enough that it carried on the broadcast. Loud enough that 30 years later people would still be talking about it. Patti LaBelle was hosting that night, sharing duties with Ahmad Rashad and Dionne Warwick. Dionne, Whitney's own cousin, was sitting right there as part of the show's lineup while the crowd turned on a member of her own family in real time, on live television, with nowhere for either of them to hide. Whitney sat there and took it. Her face barely moved. That's the part that gets people, even now, watching the old footage. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She kept that smile glued on like armor because the cameras were rolling and because she had been trained since childhood to never let anyone see the moment something actually hurt. But something did break in her that night. She'd talk about it for years afterward, in interviews and quiet moments, always circling back to how much it stung to be rejected by the very community she came from. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell. The real moments behind the music, the nights that shaped the legends. Hit subscribe if you want more of this. To understand why that room turned on her, you have to go back further, back to where Whitney actually came from. She grew up in Newark, New Jersey, singing in the choir at New Hope Baptist Church under the eye of her mother, Sissy Houston, one of the most respected gospel and session singers in the business. Whitney didn't learn to sing in a vocal booth. She learned in church, surrounded by people who treated singing like testimony, like something you gave your whole chest to. Her cousin Dionne Warwick was already a star by the time Whitney was a little girl, and her godmother was Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul herself. That's the world Whitney came up in. Not a manufactured pop world, but a deep generational lineage of black female vocalists who had earned every bit of their reputation the hard way, on stages and in studios long before MTV existed. She wasn't an outsider borrowing somebody else's sound. She was raised inside the tradition by the people who built it. By the time she signed with Arista Records and Clive Davis in the early 80s, she had a voice that critics struggled to even describe properly. Effortless power. Control most singers spend a lifetime chasing. But Clive Davis and the label made a calculated decision about how to present her, and that decision would follow her for the rest of her career. They positioned Whitney as crossover, polished, safe for pop radio, safe for mainstream television, safe for the kind of audiences that record labels in the 80s, still quietly categorized as white America. Her songs leaned pop. Her image leaned glamorous. Her videos played constantly on MTV, back when MTV barely played any black artists at all. It worked commercially beyond anyone's wildest projections. She became the first artist, male or female, to land 7 consecutive #1 singles. She broke records that still stand. But somewhere in that climb, a narrative started forming in certain corners of the black community that Whitney had been packaged, sanitized, made palatable in a way that felt like a betrayal. The whispers started showing up at industry events before 1989 ever happened. A year earlier, at the same Soul Train Awards, her name had already drawn a mixed reaction from parts of the crowd. It wasn't yet the full eruption it would become, but it was there, a low murmur under the surface, the first cracks in something that was about to give way completely. So when 1989 came around and the boos hit full volume, it wasn't really a single moment. It was years of resentment finally finding a release, and Whitney happened to be standing exactly where it landed. People in the room that night have described the energy shifting almost instantly. Laughter died down. Conversations paused. Even people who weren't booing went quiet because nobody quite knew what to do with what was happening live, on camera, to one of the biggest stars in the world. And here's where the story usually stops, in most of the retellings. Whitney got booed, Whitney was hurt. The end. But that wasn't actually the end of that night for her, because somewhere in that same stretch of time, in the orbit of that same Soul Train world, Whitney Houston crossed paths with a young singer from the group New Edition named Bobby Brown. Bobby was a Boston kid, one of the original members of New Edition before he went solo and built his own name with hits like My Prerogative. He'd grown up in the projects, scrapping for everything, nothing handed to him. He carried himself like someone who had nothing to prove to anybody, which in its own way made him the exact opposite of the version of Whitney the public had been sold for almost a decade. It's one of those strange details of history that almost nobody plans for. The same cultural moment that delivered one of the most painful public rejections of her career also put her in the same room as the man she would eventually marry. Two completely different energies colliding at once. Humiliation on one side of the night, an unexpected spark on the other. Bobby was nothing like the image the world had built around Whitney. He was raw where she was polished, street where she was rehearsed, loud where she had spent her whole career being told to stay composed. People who knew them both have said that was exactly the pull. He represented something she felt she'd been kept away from her entire life. An unfiltered, unapologetic blackness that the industry had quietly nudged her away from in pursuit of crossover success. Think about the timing of that. On the same stage where a room full of her own community had just told her, in the loudest way possible, that she wasn't really one of them anymore, she meets someone who embodies exactly the identity she'd allegedly lost. It's hard not to read that as something close to fate, even if neither of them understood it that way in the moment. Whitney would go on to talk, in later years, about how much that period messed with her sense of self. She knew exactly who she was when she was a kid in that choir at New Hope Baptist. She knew exactly who she was in her mother's living room. But somewhere between the management decisions and the crossover marketing and the constant pressure to be everything to everyone, that certainty got harder to hold on to. The Soul Train boos weren't just an awkward awards show moment. For Whitney, they became proof of something she'd already started fearing, that no matter how much success she had, she might never fully belong anywhere. Too pop for the black audience that raised her. Too black in some rooms to be taken seriously as a pure pop act. Caught in the middle, with nowhere that felt completely safe, and yet she kept going up on that stage afterward, again and again, for years. She didn't disappear. She didn't change her sound to chase approval. She kept making the music she wanted to make, kept hitting those impossible notes, kept showing up. That's the part of this story that tends to get lost. Everybody remembers the boos. Fewer people remember that 2 years later, in 1991, the same artist who'd been humiliated at the Shrine Auditorium walked out in front of an entire stadium and the world during the Super Bowl, in the middle of a war, and delivered a national anthem performance so overwhelming, it's still considered one of the greatest live vocal performances in American history. The Gulf War had started just days before that performance. Security around Tampa Stadium was tighter than it had ever been for a Super Bowl. There were real fears about what could happen with that many people gathered in one place during wartime. Whitney stood there anyway in a white tracksuit with a single microphone and sang the anthem a cappella over a pre-recorded orchestral track, something almost nobody had attempted on that stage before. By the time she hit the final notes, people across the country were standing in their living rooms with tears running down their faces. The single was rushed onto the charts and became a genuine commercial hit. An anthem of an anthem, born directly out of a year that had started with her sitting in a room full of people who didn't want her there. She didn't get there by avoiding pain. She got there by carrying it on stage with her every single time, and somehow turning it into something that silenced every single doubt in the room. Her relationship with Bobby Brown, the one that started taking shape around that same chaotic stretch of time, would go on to define a huge part of her public life in the years that followed. It brought joy. It also brought its own storm of complications that played out in front of cameras for the rest of her career. But it started quietly, almost as a footnote on one of the hardest nights of her professional life. There's something deeply human about that. The worst moments and the moments that change everything don't usually arrive separately. They show up at the same time, tangled together, and you don't get to choose which one defines you. Whitney got booed by a room that should have been celebrating her, and in that same room, her future started without her even realizing it. People love to talk about Whitney Houston's voice like it existed in a vacuum, like it was just raw talent that floated above everything else happening in her life. It didn't. Every note she ever hit carried the weight of nights like this one. The rejection, the pressure to be perfect for two completely different worlds, the constant question of whether she was enough in either direction. And maybe that's exactly why her voice hit people the way it did. It wasn't just technical perfection. It was a woman who had been told more than once, by people who should have had her back, that she didn't quite belong, and who kept singing anyway, louder, fuller, more fearless every single time. The Shrine Auditorium crowd that booed her in 1989 probably didn't think much about that night again after it happened. For Whitney, it stayed with her. She referenced it for the rest of her life in interviews and quiet conversations with people close to her, always with that same mixture of hurt and disbelief that her own community could turn on her so publicly. But she never let it stop her. That's the part we're sitting with. She walked off that stage, kept her career going, kept breaking records, kept proving, over and over, whether anyone was ready to admit it or not, that the voice in that body belonged to absolutely no one's narrow definition of what she was supposed to be. Have you ever been rejected by the very people you hoped would understand you the most? Drop your story in the comments. We want to hear it.